Hello!
Hi!
It's our special guest!
It's me.
Welcome to the not quite April, but definitely gonna count as April's studio chat.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
We decided to boost things up a little bit, not because ARX was paradropped in our back lawn, but because Josh was visiting for a dev chat. And so it made sense to get him on camera, especially now that these are not just the design chat, but the studio chat.
Yep, full studio chat. Got to bring in all of the Outlanders into the home base here.
Well, and I mean, I should say properly to introduce you, this is Josh Earsley, who is our editor on the dev team. You do tons of stuff at the company.
Yeah.
If you've read any copy, it was probably written or definitely edited by Josh, almost certainly.
Yeah, I've been wearing a lot of hats, and to be frank, I'm excited to take some of those hats off. Because we've got one new person in the studio who's going to be taking some of those hats off.
Yes.
Hey! It's Matt. We didn't plan that at all. That was completely spontaneous.
Yeah, no, this is the kind of loose energy that we bring into these studio chats. Yeah, Josh, I mean, one thing that I really like about working here, and I think your job is like the best example of it, where I think about when I've talked to you about when you were just working as a contractor for other companies, and then when you came on full time, suddenly it was like, well, what if we did like an actual usability study?
Right.
Or like, what if we actually started conducting these like large scale analyses of how our games work?
Yeah, I mean, it's all fascinating. So like for a little background, I worked in the industry for about 7 years as a full-time freelancer for many different companies. And kind of what I saw in that time was that a lot of people were basically just doing an editorial process where like the editing all got done kind of like right at the ends. And when you're in that sort of space, there's so little that you can actually do. Mm-hmm. People often were just like not testing their rulebooks, which may help to explain why the industry has been known for bad rulebooks. So when Leader, this was in 2020, mm-hmm. when all y'all were asking me to go full time, you know, one of the big reasons beyond the fact that I love all of you is that I knew that would actually give me an opportunity to do better work than I could do as a freelancer. So
yeah, I mean, it's easy for me to make this sound like a backhanded compliment towards the company itself, and it's really meant as a fulsome compliment, which is there's a very low barrier to get projects approved, generally at the studio. Like, if we're not going to lose a ton of money, and if it's interesting and worthwhile, it can probably happen. And there are exceptions, there are thresholds. One of those thresholds is like deciding to publish a game. That's like the highest barrier to clear. But anything short of adding a new title to the line, it's actually pretty easy to say like, hey, I've always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to experiment with this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so it's been fun, even in working on Oath, and then thinking about applying some of those lessons into Ahoy and now into ARX. Every one of those, I felt like we have been able to look at what we've done in the past and then adapt it differently.
Yeah.
And we couldn't do that without you being on staff and without you having access to this big well of testers and helpers.
Yeah, and it's been exciting, as I alluded to with the hats over time in terms of over the years kind of taking on more responsibilities in different places, and like now, a lot of what I'm doing from day to day is closer to traditional design and development work than than ever. Or early on, when I first came on back in vast TCC times, the ancient times, I had not to throw the company under the bus, but I had a very similar experience as with many other companies. If I came in at the last like 2 or 3 weeks of the project and just like raced to the finish line on getting that rulebook done, and over time becoming more and more integrated into the development process at more steps, into concepting, and then doing like design work on Root Marauder and now on ARX, and now working on some new Root stuff that hopefully we'll be able to show you more later. We'll talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, and there's what was I going to say about that? I think it's so interesting how like the editorial practices, I feel like they're just so different at other companies, because there is a sense sometimes in game publishing that games have to go through all these stages to be produced. One of those stages is to have an editor look at all the rules. But of course, like rules writing is design. I
Yep.
always tell when I'm working with younger designers that like, there's a temptation to not write a rule book early because of course you're going to be rewriting that rule book a lot. But actually, it's incredibly useful. Like rules writing is game design in the same way that like graphic design is game design, and they're all very tightly knitted together. And so the fact that you've moved into like the core senior dev team is no surprise to me because we can flag like rules writing issues way, way early and then know what we're getting into.
Yeah, no, I mean it's one of the fundamental things that is great about being on projects earlier is if a rule is bad, you can only rewrite it so much and edit it so much, but if the underlying thing is bad and hard to explain, there's nothing that you can do to solve that problem, basically.
Right.
So yeah.
No, I think about like, I won't name names, but there's a tendency in contemporary board game graphic design to work with a visual syntax that is very literal. So like every single action that's taken, you should like create a little icon for all the verbs. Some of this is building off of the work that was done in Race for the Galaxy, 20 years ago. But that can't be right. I guess that game is about 20 years old. Anyway,
Close to it, yeah.
I think sometimes I will look at a big long string of these graphical icons and think like, oh, the game design is kind of like on display here. And even though the icons look very beautiful, there are these like core problems in the logic of the game where I feel like if the graphic designer would have shown that sentence to the game designer very early on in the process, they would have been like, okay.
Well, we actually kind of ran into this with Root at one point a little bit. I think I remember that very, very early on when I came onto that project, I remember it being a much more icon-based.
Yep.
We really tried that, and we quickly learned, like, if you're trying to, one thing that we settled on was, okay, well, the player board should really be not just these reference tools, but they should be in themselves these teaching tools.
Sure.
And the problem with iconography is that they're terrible for teaching. You're sort of having to learn an entirely new language. There are some things in the industry that are fairly standardized,
right.
But if you're doing anything beyond like draw a card, you're going to quickly run into trouble. So we even kind of went through that process of going like, okay, well, what are the components in the game trying to do for the people around the table? Because any given component, even just like an aid. And we can talk about like how thinking about aids has progressed over the different games at the studio, but like every component could have multiple potential uses, and so you need to be purposeful about like, okay, what is this trying to accomplish? So like one example of that is don't use icons to teach usually as just like a practice. So.
Yeah, we're running into a funny problem, and this is with a non-studio project, but like when I built the Molly House player board a few weeks ago, and I put all the words on it, and I was like, oh, I don't like how many words there are. And so I did an icon version, and then when I taught it to people, I ran into the obvious problem, which was like, I had to explain the rule 10 times because the icon wasn't giving enough. But for players who know the game, they don't need all that text. Yep. And so like we'll probably actually have a reversible board that's like, here's the wordless version,
right.
And then here's the version with the block text. And I think as a company, if there's one true hallmark to like the leader games like graphical style, it's we're not afraid of words.
We're not afraid of words.
We just, the Root player boards are just like wordy.
Yeah.
Like they just, and I think we use like even like oath, like every little element. I mean, it's sort of like, I think, you play Paradox games, and I do too. And maybe it's this like subconscious holdover of the mouse over, where I want like whenever if my eye moves to like the center of the Chancellor board, like oh yeah, I'll see some information about citizenship, just kind of sitting there.
Yeah. I mean, like fundamentally, like one frame that I used to think about this often is who's doing the mental work and at what point. So like an example of this is the overview cards in Root. We have these little cards that give the descriptions of the factions. And at one point in time, early on in development, I had this idea of, oh, well, we want people to get into character with their factions. What if like the walkthrough sort of recommended like, oh, take your card and like talk about it to the other players, like introduce yourself as a faction. This seemed like a cute idea. And what we quickly discovered was that is often an awful way to do things, because it means that if somebody isn't paying attention in that exact moment then it's wasted, basically.
Yes.
Like, I'm sure many people out there, when they're teaching rules, as the rules teacher at the table, have had moments where you've had to, like, pull people's attention back toward you to be like, this is very important, I'm explaining something right now that you should listen to. And that is very much diluted when it's going between people who aren't, like, the official rules teacher. And so moving from that single card, one-to-many didactic model to, no, just give everybody a card. Give everybody a card, which means that when they're sitting at the table and they've sort of started to internalize their faction a little bit, they can go, okay, so I get my faction a little bit. Now I'm going to, like, learn a little bit about the other factions, right? They can, like, look at that card and go, okay, well, I don't have to interrupt somebody's turn necessarily to, like, do a little bit of learning on my own time. And that's where words are so great. So even if you have more words than you would think would be like good for aid material, if you are trying to encourage learning, having as much of the information there can be very useful.
Right.
And so, like, in Ahoy, for example, and then in ARCS, we put a lot of work into, like, Ahoy has this little tiny aid booklet that has, like, 95% of the rules.
It's like one of my favorite
in the game.
Things that the studio's ever made is that tiny Ahoy book, because it does tell you almost everything.
Yeah, and it was a pain in the ass to create, like, because you only have so many words, and so there's very little room for like, it's very easy to get misconceptions, basically, and so we tested the hell out of that thing. But it's in the games that I've seen with new players, it really pays off. Everybody having just, like, that little tiny rules aid is really helpful.
Well, and it has a level of precision that you don't see in a lot of aids. Like, we were playing Ahoy, and I actually had a rules question where I think I'm probably I might be in the 3-digit camp on Ahoy. I'm like getting close. There's just been a lot of Ahoy games. Maybe I'm in the 50s or 60s. And I had, like, a very specific rules question, and I didn't know where the rulebook was, but I saw a little aid, and I picked it up, and it was there.
Yeah, like, everything, like, when it comes to aids and rulebooks, you need to think about everything as a holistic system. All of the aids, the rulebook, the components. Your failure case scenario is that someone opens the rulebook, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is the ultimate fallback case for, hey, does somebody know the answer to this question? Or even before that, like, ideally, somebody already figures out the question on their own without having to interrupt the flow of play at the table. Yeah. Then asking questions. Then, if everything else fails, going to the rule book. And so designing that whole ecosystem of where's the information in an accessible way, so that game flow just doesn't have to be broken.
One of my favorite stories that I tell sometimes about this, and this was, like, the biggest thing from going to working on games as a hobby, as kind of a sideline, and as a contractor, to working professionally, is when I sat through my very first rules read for Root, where we had observers at tables and we were just watching groups play. And at the table I had, they didn't read the rule book. They just went through the rulebook and they were, like, they, like, read the examples together, and then they looked at the player boards and they just started playing, and they started that game playing, like, 50% Root. They were playing a weird fan version of Root, but by the end of the game, they were darn near, like, 85, 90% playing correctly, and it was because all of the little things that were not the rulebook kept guiding them back towards the correct path.
Yeah.
And I know folks don't have it quite yet, but the ARCS little booklet, which was, we talked about that little booklet before ARCS was, like, really properly designed.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things about the ARCS teach is that there are these 4 player aids that are a single sheet of paper folded, basically. And the front of it has all the card flow. The middle spread is all the actions, and then the back is all the scoring, victory stuff. And what I love about teaching ARCS is I will teach the full game in usually about 15 minutes, and then I'll say, if you have any questions in this guide, and I just give them, like, the little 10-second, here's how the guide works, and the rulebook, like, never comes out. Yeah. It's amazing.
That's my hope and dream.
Yeah,
that's
so we will see.
Yeah,
we'll see. When will we get it? Okay. Well, actually, on that, we should start. That's Josh. Now let's talk about the studio stuff. Josh comes to visit a few times a year.
Yep.
It is always extremely busy. We want to make the most of the time, but we also like hanging out, so it just ends up, like, I mean, it's sort of like a little mini convention, except we don't have floor time.
Yep. A retreat.
Yeah, it is. It feels like a retreat. I think that one thing that we've talked about this before is like moving forward, having more of the folks who work remote come out and like having like actual more proper retreats. Because I think it can be hard sometimes to be doing this while also trying to do our day jobs and keep everything up because I am tired. But one thing that we do with these retreats is we always try to plug you into basically everything that is working, everything that we're working on. And at the same time, we get to play some games and have some good time. Maybe we'll talk about those too. But let's jump into the studio stuff.
Absolutely.
So we talked about this a little bit in the last stream that I was on. The studio is in a exciting period. We've got some new folks that we're bringing on. We've just expanded our team by hiring another graphic designer named Megan Gainey, who will be more properly introducing a little bit later on. And we've got another person coming a little later too, which we'll talk about. As we're growing, we are also working on all these projects.
Yeah.
So the studio right now, we basically are working on 4 projects simultaneously, which is the most the studio's ever worked on at once. So first, Ahoy is in its final stages.
Yep. Expansion, yeah.
And then we have an Oath expansion and a Root expansion project, and then Patrick is working on his cooperative game Opus, and so we can touch on all those things.
Yeah.
But let's start with Ahoy. So you've played a bunch of Ahoy this week.
Yep, played a lot of Ahoy. We busted out this whiteboard at the beginning of the week, and we're like, all right, let's schedule all the Ahoy playtests. Just ba. So we've been playing tons and tons of Ahoy. It's in a really good spot. Largely this week, my impression at this point is basically like the blue and the yellow faction, the Blackfin and the Shellfire. I mean, they haven't really seen any like extremely minor changes this week. Basically, just like, oh, this dice slot should have like slightly like tighter restriction.
There was like a
something
super small yellow adjustment.
Yeah. More work has been going into the Coral Cap and the Leviathan, and I'm just super happy with how, just the beginning of this week and the end of this week, I just feel really good about them now.
They're in a great spot.
It's been so, I love these visits because it just gives an opportunity for just such intense, intimate, high bandwidth like design jamming.
Yes.
And so like whenever you have these like really hard development problems that are still remaining, just being able to get face to face, regain some of that like almost jazz energy of just being in the same room with somebody and being able to give out a lot of bad ideas. You generally tend to find some good ideas nestled in all of those bad ideas. I'm really happy with how the Coral Cap and Leviathan have shaped up. The Leviathan, I had basically like a few weeks ago, we had been playing the Leviathan a little bit, and then I was sort of given like carte blanche to just like propose essentially my own Leviathan as just kind of like a let's break out of the thinking of what this faction is right now, and maybe nothing will come of it, maybe something will come of it. And by and large, we just sort of like ended up taking cannibalizing little bits and pieces from that.
Yeah, it's a good example of how sometimes that iteration works. Where like you made your proposal was a very different kind of Leviathan.
Yes, yeah.
And there were elements that we could totally fold into the core.
Exactly. Right. And that's like the critical thing is that like even though only like 1 or 2 elements actually went into sort of the mainline design, those changes actually opened up a different sort of design space than what was there before.
Right.
And then that allowed us to make changes that weren't basically possible before with the faction. Right. So sometimes bringing in somebody to just be like, well, how about this? Even if you know that most of it's going to be thrown away is a really helpful exercise. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've kind of folded everything back into that mainline design now. And it's tightened up a lot. It feels like I played a game yesterday where I was in it. I was like, everything feels like it's firing great. Very happy with where it is now. Yeah.
I played a game with Matt, and I was, I don't think I had done a playtest with Matt, and I'm going to talk to the person who's back there now. But Matt was like playing very well, and I had been used to like casually winning or doing pretty okay in my games of Ahoy. But then suddenly I was dealing with someone who was like, he was counting the score before scoring.
That's how you beat Cole. Is you like count
just
the score.
A little, like, look, I am not a strong player of pretty much any game. I'm like a good B-. So I'm good at like beating a lazy player or a new player, but once someone's actually engaged with me, I'm worthless.
Yeah. Nin for me is asking, who is this Matt guy?
Don't listen to him.
Okay, he's joking. He's being a jokester right now.
Who is this Matt guy? I don't know. There was a good question actually, which I just want to bring in because I actually think, and I'm gonna answer it with kind of an anecdote. So someone asked in the chat how much we like care about questions on BGG, and I actually think this is a place where you and I, Josh, began this job at a similar point and have also are currently in a different attitude towards it. So when we were working on the Law of Root, the idea was like the platonic essential of a wargaming rulebook, which is like it needs to be feature complete and like an iron, like a tank, like no holes. Right. And it didn't matter if people didn't get it on BGG because those fools weren't appreciating this like diamond we were building. Right. And we were filled with hubris, but it was just coming from the perspective of like, our job is to be, we're trying to be caretakers of the word and of the design, and that's the thing that matters. And I feel like the longer I have worked in games, the more I'm like, no, actually BGG rules threads as a, like just a metric of how much confusion a rulebook is being generated. It's actually a pretty useful thing. And so I'm always interested, I'm less interested in, like the specific question as someone couldn't find the answer and felt the need to ask the question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a complicated thing because, like, certainly, like the Law of Root, as you said, takes this wargaming tradition of like a strongly literal rules wording, not being concerned with like being primarily concerned with what is laid out in the text, basically, and being less concerned with convention. And certainly, I think got a little carried away with that, to the point where now in the Law of Root, basically we have a little preamble that's like, okay, you might not be used to what we're doing here. But it's for a good reason, it serves a specific purpose, but let's actually go through like, how do you actually read this thing? Like what is the best way to read this? Because all language is context bound, all language is context dependent. And so if you're not coming from that tradition, you're gonna be kind of lost. But there is a reason why we do it. It's an important reason, but the fact that a good part of the audience was like, we don't know how to interpret this was a problem. So we have this little preamble now ever since I think the third printing or something like that. It's like, okay, welcome to Law of Root.
Fourth printing.
Yeah, third or fourth printing, where it's like, welcome to Law of Root. Glad you're here. Here's a few like ground rules for like how to read this thing. This is going to help you essentially to read it. And so like getting all of that feedback very early on was extremely helpful, seeing the places where interpretation, whether coming from experiences with other games or coming from experiences with different styles of rulebook, were rightfully getting in the way of people's correct interpretation. And that's not the people's fault. That's our fault for not setting basically like, this is what we're doing here. And so like, I think that over time we've gotten a lot better in terms of, I think about Oath and I think about like, okay, listen, we're gonna have a whole page here. Here's the weird stuff about this game. Like you are going to be used to, like, oh, when you discard a card, it's going to go in the discard pile where you are. No, it's not how it works in this game. It's actually this thing. So like being more tuned to places where we purposefully, because as a studio, I think that we like breaking genre. We like trying just like wacky things. And the flip side of that is you need to be very, very careful about making sure that people understand how you might be doing something different from the convention.
I kind of separate in like two phases of thought after the initial one, and one of them is, in Root, I will never forget a slightly buzzed friend calling me late one night to yell at me about the rule book.
Yeah.
Who I hadn't talked to this person in like 5 years.
Sure.
And he called me up. He was very upset because it was his first turn as the Woodland Alliance, and he didn't know where he was allowed to put sympathy. Because
Sure.
you have to play sympathy adjacent to other sympathy,
Right.
comma, if possible.
Sure.
And
Right.
of course, someone reading that rule is going to have the initial feeling of like, but if there's not on the board, where and like that is something that's so easy to fix with like a 6-word sentence in
Right.
italics.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it didn't. I was like, I'm not going to spend words on that.
And so this is why, like, you know, people have different opinions on this. I know some people don't like this, but this is one big reason why in ARCs, like as we've gone through projects, in ARCs, there's a whole marginalia in the rule book. Like it basically separates the bot rather than having like a bunch of like interspersed little callouts or something like that. We actually dedicate a bar that's like, okay, here's our marginalia bar, and this is where like page references to other important like like this is what this is talking about. Like we're using this term, it's defined over here. Here's a little clarification. Like using that space to really have our literal rule. Trying to have our cake and eat it too a little bit here.
Yeah.
Have that literal rule and then just be like, okay, no, but listen, like this is the full context that this rule is encapsulated in. And like in reads, like I think people responded really, really well.
And like Aaliyah was doing this for the last, I mean, since the year 2000,
right.
basically. Right? The entire Aaliyah series, when Patty and I were looking at rulebook layouts, I took out my copy of Traders of Genoa and I was like, look at this sidebar and the kind of work it's doing. And Aaliyah would get into trouble because sometimes they would put important rules in the sidebar.
Right. That's the very important thing is that you are not. You cannot put, if you're doing that style, you cannot put canonical rules in that marginalia. But it's just such a useful resource for building that context around the rule in a way that doesn't interrupt. Like if you're just trying to read, in a way that doesn't interrupt that like main flow. Of if you're confused about something, you can know, okay, well I have this marginalia, I see that something's here, I have a question, maybe it will answer it. And oftentimes, it's going to answer that question that you have of just like, okay, I saw like one use case for this is like you introduce a term early on in like your core concept section, and then the next instance of that term doesn't come up for a little while. But it's important to define it in like your, listen, okay, like this is like the core stuff that you need to know to understand the whole structure, but like it might not show up for a while. But the next time it shows up, if it shows up 3 or 4 pages later, often people have forgotten what that term means. And so just being able to go like, listen, this is the term, here's where it's defined, and having that almost like a mesh. It's another way of sort of doing, like in the law of root we do the like section references, it's another way of creating that mesh of references, and it gives you a little bit more flesh on the bone.
It's the one thing I would love to see more wargame publishers do, because I think I love the style of a wargaming rulebook, but I really wish they would use sidebars, because they have good examples usually built in line, and they have great glossaries, but it'd be so nice to have a contextual sidebar that was like, oh, a brigade, that's this, just so you really understand. Because I feel like sometimes there's this like this weird wink where they'll be like, you can only have 2 capital U units per hex. And they're like, wink, and like what you want is in the parentheses to be like, look, these things don't count as units. But instead they're like trying to force you to do it. And there is a pedagogical dimension I think is sort of an older school of teaching. Anyway, I think, and then the other thing about the rulebooks, and this is something you've already touched on, is I think that we have become more aware of the oddness of the things that we make, and we're a little bit better at calling them out. And so ARCs is a really interesting case because as a piece of design, almost every rule you need is on that little fold out, and yet the rule book itself is long.
It's a lot larger.
Yeah, and it's long because it needs to really walk you through the concepts, because basically everything in ARCs is different than,
I mean the actions just like this. We settle at a certain point, in development. We were thinking about like, okay, well, what does like a base game of ARCs look like? Like, what is that first time game? Because we had like the leaders and lore stuff that we eventually decided like, no, there's actually like this game is rules like. Fairly rules simple compared to some of our other games. Like it's less complicated than Root, certainly. Much less complicated than Oath. But at the same time, and so like you would think that, oh yeah, throw the leaders and lore in there, but no, the action system and the victory system. Like when people sit down at the table, like doing usability tests on this, people would just ignore that stuff.
Yep.
Like I would just like look at their eyes and like I would try to track whether people were actually looking at that content, and on their first game, they just would not.
Yeah. And if the leaders, and I don't think this is something we ever explicitly said, but I know you and I were both thinking about it, if the leaders were just positive things, they could be ignored. But because there's a restriction built in, you can only give them to a player if they're really going to pay attention to them.
Exactly.
Otherwise it'll break.
Yeah, the worst thing is like you get halfway through a game and you're like, oh, we weren't playing it right for like half a game.
Yeah, I've just been cheating.
Okay, I've just been cheating rampantly. So.
So going back to studio things, so we've done a ton of work on Ahoy helping Nick. It's been great. It's been so fun seeing the Leviathan and the Coral Cap really snap together.
Yep.
The Coral Cap was interesting because the Coral Cap, I felt like the changes have been a little bit more measured and a little easier, a little more tractable. The Leviathan, if you were to just look at it, it wouldn't probably look that different. But it was just a few little things in their scoring logic and how their turn flow worked.
Thinking a lot about like end game noise as a frame and trying to work out what that looked like in this specific context.
Right.
Because like whenever you have a multiplayer conflict game with trackable victory points, you always run into these problems of, okay, we're reaching the end game. How do we create something that is surprising, basically?
Yeah.
You know, that there's little that like it's very unsatisfying when you just sort of like roll. You just kind of like roll into that end game, and it's like, okay, well they're obviously going to win, or oh they're obviously going to win. Let's all just stomp on them. Adding uncertainty, whether it's explicit or implicit, like player action dynamics, what is possible within the actions of that faction, are all important for shaping that end game to be surprising. And so for the Leviathan, I think that the end game was a pretty big focus there in terms of like, okay, well for the smuggler, the way that we accomplish this is by using those pledge cards and having these hidden points. We do sort of much the same thing for the Coral Cap, but for the Leviathan, it turned out that sort of like obfuscating strategy just really, it wasn't the right way to go, basically. Right. And so now, we've opted for a more dynamic map scoring with them. Like previously, the way that they worked was basically they would have this point game based on the number of different regions that the Leviathan was in. And now we've sort of opted more for more of a snake style, where it's like you count your longest section of like body and head pieces, and like that is the number of points that you score in a round. And that in itself, even though it's not technically obfuscating anything, provides a lot more of that dynamicity that you're looking for, that dynamicness that you're looking for, because like you can have like two disconnected like body sections, and then you can scoot a head in, or like you can
cut the snake in half dramatically.
Exactly.
Like, it creates these like climaxes, these moments. I always feel like that one thing that I think the studio does a really good job at is thinking about the narrative shape of the games and making sure they have these high points, these reveals, these moments of witnessing. And I think that was something that we couldn't quite figure out with the Leviathan, and Nick did a really good job figuring out like a slightly new scoring logic to give them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's Ahoy's in great shape. I don't know how soon Nick will be moving those changes to the online kits. I imagine it'll be within a week or so, probably. They could already be there, although I don't want to say that. Sorry, Nick. Anyway, Ahoy's in a really good shape. I think there's some more design work that needs to be done on the Treasures in Turmoil, like kind of small expansion, which I'm sure Nick will be on the next studio chat and he can talk more about that. But Ahoy's in a great shape, and then Kyle is just churning through the art. Like it's one of those things that every day it's getting closer.
Yep.
Like Patty has been working on the actual graphic design for the player boards. We have things out for quoting right now. We have a really cool surprise that hopefully we'll be able to share in a few weeks that I am like so jazzed about.
It's so much of a surprise that I think I've even forgotten what it was.
It's awesome, but we don't know for sure yet. So I just gonna say that. And then for other stuff, So I'll say a little bit about Opus, just so folks are aware of it, and then I'll talk about Oath, and we can wind up with some root stuff. So Opus is Patrick's cooperative game about robots becoming human. It's St. Paul, becoming human. And it's intriguing. It's interesting to see both a lighter game and a cooperative game worked on in the studio, and Patrick is making kind of interesting progress on it. I haven't played it the most recent cut, but I think I'm going to get a chance to look at it this afternoon.
So. Yeah, likewise. We're both waiting with bated breath.
It's in the exciting step where, I love this step where every single time I look at it on the table, it looks totally differently. To me, that is always a sign of like, I use this sometimes when I'm talking to folks about design, where I'm like, if you're caught in the orbit of a powerful idea, the design itself will constantly change.
Yeah.
But like, it's still the same design. And sometimes when I see a design that's not changing, I'm like, you're just not in a very strong orbit. Like it's just holding together.
Yeah, if you're early in the process and you're not like drastically re-envisioning like every week, something might be wrong.
Yeah, like you might. It's just the chances that you hit upon the actual like correct intervention first off are like so low. And then I have been working a ton on Oath stuff. So we're working on this Oath expansion. And it's been very interesting. So basically what I've done is I made like a big suite of features. And the operating assumption of these features were basically, as we worked on Oath, there were all these ideas that didn't fit in Oath. And they kind of like formed the seed of Arcs. And then we worked on Arcs, and all these ideas that didn't really work in Arcs. And so they've become the seed for the Oath expansion.
Yeah, that's how game design works. It's all like an Ouroboros, sort of thing. We're all just eating our own tails with these ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And so the core premise, though, for the Oath expansion is that when we were working on Oath, we didn't really know what we were building. I think, Josh, you had a lot of experience in role-playing games, and I really wanted to make like a PAX Legacy game. I think Nick really loves like combo-y driven games.
Yep.
And that synthesis produced Oath. And then as we have watched the game find its audience, it has found a real home in the role-playing game community. People love that, and people doing like the long campaign games. I love running into Oath fans at conventions because, you run into Root fans and they're like, oh, I love the Vagabond. Here's my favorite Vagabond. Sign, here's a picture my kid drew or something. And you can tell they love Root. They want to sit in the world of Root. But I don't have a sense of how much Root they're actually playing.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. And maybe they're playing a lot, or maybe they're not playing a lot. It doesn't really matter. They are living in the world. The Oath fans come up to me and they say, I just bought my second journal. We're in the hundreds of games in our Chronicle. And they'll start telling me like, well, when you get that far in the Chronicle, these weird things start happening. Like when you're only playing a 4-suited deck
right.
or whatever, because of just how the deck healing works. And so I'm like, okay, well, is there a way then that we can think about the next Oath thing as a way of rounding out the legacy component of the game? So what I did then is I kind of made a big laundry list of some interesting concepts and ideas that we've been building out and kind of testing. And these include things like, for the individual player positions, having a little lineage system that allows you to have little side quests that you can unlock during a game that will give you access to different powers. Those side quests give you things to care about. And I kept thinking to a conversation I had with my brother when I was working on it. I told Drew, like, if I have a copy of Oath and I play it 20 times, and if you have a copy of Oath and you play it 20 times, and we trade copies, they should feel different.
Right.
And I think they feel different right now in subtle ways, and I would love them to feel different in dramatic ways. So right now, the way the expansion's shaping up is I'm building out this lineage system. I'm working on a new way of doing the Chronicle phase that splits the responsibilities among the players and also gives more tools for the players to customize and build Oath in their own way.
I mean, it's exciting. When you pitched it, it very much felt like, oh, yeah, why didn't we think of this in the first place? It felt it just slides into the design very, very cleanly. So I agree with what you're talking about with, my experience at cons too has been people, when they come up and talk about Oath, I had this one family come up, I think it was Gen Con, this family with a dad and 2 sons and a daughter, and they were all like really excited. You know, they were telling me about how they were 25 games into their Chronicle, and the kids were complaining about how like, yeah, like dad like always writes all like the wrong stuff in the Chronicle, like he's writing his own history. And I said something like, well, I mean, the winner gets to write the history, right? And all of the kids simultaneously go, he doesn't even win the game. And it's just these really beautiful moments. So yeah.
So I'll give you a small example. So the Chronicle will have less steps. Basically, the tasks of the Chronicle will be divided among the player who won the game, the player with the people's favor, and the player with the darkest secret. So those 3 like seats get to make the choices. But the player with the darkest secret, in many cases, is going to get to determine the next victory condition. And there are these things called foundation cards. And the foundation cards basically allow players, in particular the player with the darkest secret, to change a core rule of the game. So for instance, you're going to draw some of these foundation cards, and one of them might say like, the scepter breaks, and you take the grand scepter out of the game. The concept of citizenship gets like sunsetted, and then there's another foundation card you mix in that is like the reforging of the scepter, so you can always turn the things back on. But if players can then gradually build different kinds of oaths, and the governing idea is that like oath is essentially a tree. I mean, every game you work on is one specific incarnation of a whole web of ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think oath, more than most designs, and perhaps only comparable to ARCs in this way, there were other paths that we could have gone on that would have also generated a good game. Yeah. And so one thing I would like to do with this expansion is to give players some instructions to say like, hey, if you haven't played Oath in a while, here's how you can unwind Oath to its simplest version.
Yeah, it really, Oath was, it was a whole time to work on in terms of the original Teach. Like there are so many interlocking and strange ideas in that game, where one of the things that we found, like as I was doing rulebook reads, was context, even for simply why would I even do a particular action, like needed to kind of be spelled out in the rulebook, because it's this woolly kind of impressionistic, you're like exploring this world and you're like seeing what it has to offer. And like you learn about all these cool things that you can do and all of these cool relationships. And then like it's like, okay, now we're going to talk about citizenship. And like there are these things in that design where it's like, as we're revisiting it, we're kind of going, well, maybe that right at the beginning is like a little bit too much. Right. Even in it makes me think of convention demos. In convention demos, we basically agreed we're not going to talk about citizenship. Right. It's just one thing too many, and like that kind of applies to the game itself in some ways. It's like for that very first game, it can kind of get in the way of like really getting into the game and getting your head around everything that it has to offer. And
you can have a rules module. So again, the person with the darkest secrets looking at these foundation cards, and they might say like, oh, let's activate exile kingdoms, which will let everybody hold the sites they rule to the next game. Yep. And then like, that's kind of like a step towards the citizenship concept. Right. And you can see these things sort of like emerge sort of organically. And so I've got a whole list of foundations, and we've been kind of testing them and thinking through them. We also have different versions of the Darkest Secret, of the People's Favor, that are a little more stripped down, both of which build on earlier design ideas that we're able to, like, with a few more years experience, look at again and say like, okay, there was this other way of making this work that we didn't go down. And then, one of the goals that I have is to me, Oath opens up the moment when you realize that that winning might not be the most important thing. Right. And ARCs it was funny, like that was part of the thesis of Oath. I wanted players to disengage from the question about winning and recontextualize it. But I don't think I really got that until we were almost done with ARCs, and I would play a game of ARCs, and someone would be like, I don't care about winning this ambition, I really need to like unlock this part of content. And I thought, okay, so if we want players to disengage from winning, we have to give them something else. And so the new Oath stuff, you might be playing the game and you might say, look, I can't take control of this situation. I'm going to go try to win the Darkest Secret so I can determine the shape of the game next time. Or maybe if I do this little side quest, it'll unlock this element that gets added to like my personal lineage. That's something I'm going to carry through to the next game. And then the other thing that we're kind of adding to that is more identity around the empires. So I'm working on this game, which I hate calling a kind of roll and write, but it sort of is. Because I mean, roll and writes to me, I have so many feelings about roll and writes. I think the idea of a piece of paper, a game played on a piece of paper with a pencil, is powerful.
Yes.
But it is so weirdly utilized, and I think the idea got like captured by the party game space.
Sure.
And so they're forever associated with party games. But really, when I look at it, I think, no, a game you're playing with a piece of paper and a pencil means that it's a game that can be played slowly over many games.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that every empire has like a little sheet of paper where when you do the chronicle steps, the things that used to be like the build edifice stage, that's now like a thing that you unlock and engage with as you manage your little empire. This also allows you to record the different dynasties of your empire, how long the empire's been around, and you can unlock special powers that act during the chronicle phase. Some of these ideas, by the way, are from versions of the Arcs intermission that we couldn't quite get to work.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were talking about this the other day where it's like, because Arcs is this 3-act trilogy, you only have 2 intermissions, which is great for its game structure. Like, we built that game with that in mind. We wanted to tune what happened in the intermission to the creative limitations with the trilogy. And Oath, because it's infinite, as it stands, just gives you a whole different tool set to work with, basically. You wouldn't be able to do a sort of roll and write empire log in Arcs at all, because it would be silly. You'd just be like, oh, okay, we did this, next intermission did this, and rip it up. Well, game's over.
And Arcs had this, like, Arcs also has like a narrative problem with it, where we used to have that I mean, really, this is one of the last things that got thrown away, thrown out when we were working on Arcs. We had that intermission system with like the crises. And eventually we were like, well, the game actually handles a crisis. So like, put all of that cool intermission stuff, that should just be in the game. And then the actual intermission in Arcs is like mostly bookkeeping. Outside of the choice of fate. So that's all the Oath stuff. There are some other features that I haven't talked about too much. Oh, well, one thing I'll mention is, I would like the Chronicles to also have some kind, I would love the Chronicles to like tilt towards apocalypse, basically. I want them to kind of be falling apart. And so the idea is bad things can happen in your games. There can be a crisis that could, I was likening it to a forest fire, where it's like, imagine there's a forest fire in the hinterland. If you don't do anything, it's still gonna be there next game. Maybe it would have gotten a little bit worse. And it's kind of up to the players to decide, like, look, do I want to improve like the lineage of my family? Do I want to try to like grab for the brass ring, or build out my kingdom? Or am I going to worry about this like actual crisis? And the stakes of the crisis are the destruction of the Chronicle fully, and kind of restarting from flat, from a baseline. Because a lot of people who played Arcs were like, they want a meta structure. They want like a large scale story structure to just give their games a little bit of weight. And I think that we can do that.
No, I'm super excited.
That's all I'm working on right now, mostly. And then lastly, we've rung the bell and have started like proper pre-production work on the root expansion stuff.
I'm excited. Like, around the time, a little bit before Oath finished up, probably sometime around like, I think September, August, I think you had started, asking me questions about like, would you be interested?
Before Arcs, finished up.
Before Arcs finished up. Would you be interested in this kind of thing? And I'm super interested. And now that I've had a little time to like rest after finishing Arcs, because the end there was a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
It was so much work. I'm digging into that. We can't give like all of the specifics right now. It's still very, very early. I've been told I can't tell you the animals yet. We're still figuring out the animals.
The animal conversation is a whole conversation. It's a whole conversation.
But I can talk a little bit about kind of the broad concepts that I want to explore in this expansion. So basically, the thing that is fascinating to me about the thing that fascinates me most about these factions is that I want to make factions that are more porous to outside influence from other players compared to the other factions. I want players to be able to create proxy wars through these factions, to mess with their internal politics. The stuff in Root that excites me the most are when you can tell a story about how politics works, about how different kinds of political systems, actors in there consolidate power, and how they interact with like the inhabitants of the woodland as like a political body, because Root is fundamentally not just about the factions, these are factions in the woodland, but it's also about the creatures, right? It's about all of this stuff. And so right now I'm working on 2 factions. One faction, the idea is that it is kind of a law assembly. Basically, you have this kind of roving assembly that travels around the woodland. And you are basically going to be proposing different kinds of laws that the woodland would want to see. Because a lot of the woodland, I must imagine, is not really psyched about the war, like this war kind of raging in their woodland. And so these laws are things like preventing battles in specific clearings, or preventing the building of buildings in clearings, or other such things. So these are generally restrictive laws. And the way that this works, as it stands right now, is you'll sort of propose a law. You have these tokens that constitute the laws. You like hold up a token and say, "All right, I propose that no warriors can be placed in this clearing." And the enemy player that has the most pieces there has a chance to override you. So you have this like open hand of cards that shows kind of your support. And the way for that player to override you is to give you at least as many cards of that matching that clearing as you already have. So they're like, no, listen, I've got more mass support, that's not going to fly. You're not going to pass this law in this clearing. Instead, I'm going to pass this other law instead. So laws are always being passed. Fundamentally, Root is only like a 7-round game, so you want to make sure that the game stays actually always changing. And so that other player who overrode you will go, no, actually, instead of the no warriors, we're going to put the no building. Right. And that might make you go like, oh no, you've got me now. There's a lot of funny stuff that you have to do with a faction like this to make sure that it doesn't utterly break other factions, especially the Eerie. There are problems to work out, but excited about that faction.
Someone mentioned they're like, oh, this sounds like Arcs, it sounds like something from John Company. The thing about Root that is both like frustrating and also fun is how short it is. And like Arcs, let's say you play like a 4-handed game of Arcs and you've got 6 cards in every hand. That's 24 impulses.
Right.
And Root is 7.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So like Arcs can tell these like really fine-grained stories, like lots of little reversals. Or I'm playing a game of Annie and Abyss right now on Rally the Troops. And I was reminded like, oh, coin games are long.
Yeah.
Lots of little actions. And when you've been working on Root, like when we were talking about the law passage or not, I just want to underline what you just said, which is like, even if that law doesn't pass, another law needs to pass instead, because we're kind of like working in these like brighter colors. And actually, one of the things that makes Root work so well is how like chunky the turns are and its like narrative blocks are.
Yeah, and so that's one of the 2 factions that I'm working on. The other one is basically it's a diaspora. It's a collection of creatures that used to live in the woodlands, were driven out at some point and want to basically come back. And your way of going about that can be peaceful, can be violent, and it depends upon how other players interact with you. So I want to create this kind of exploration of what it means to come back to a place that you used to be in. And so, again, I want to think about internal politics as this driver for having to deal with your own people, basically. These factions, a lot of them, for very good reasons, for playability reasons, you have a lot of authority to do things. And I want to explore ideas about what happens when you have a little less authority. Right. And so generally the way that this works is it introduces a whole new suit of cards. So you'll have a little deck of cards. Right now it's 12 cards, and they're all basically identical. They're all just suited to whatever the animal will end up being. It's suited to you. The only difference between these cards is that they represent more peaceful or more militant parts of your internal politics of your faction. And so what this looks like in play is you're going to be placing tokens on the map that represent basically your back in that area of the woodland. You've resettled, you've integrated into society in that way. And it can either be peaceful, in which case that faction is now double suited. So you could have
that clearing,
that clearing is double suited, yeah. So you could have a fox, whatever the animal is clearing, or if it turns militant, it actually covers the previous suit. So you're actually driving out the majority creature that was in that clearing. So it's trying to model this idea of, listen, you're trying to reintegrate into the society, and that can look very different depending upon what happens. It can look like peaceful coexistence, or it can look like a more violent, dominant kind of reinscription of the war from people who were probably driven out by war in the first place. So. And so the idea here is that we want to interconnect, this new suit with the other factions. And so the way that we do that is that this deck of cards, these aren't just cards that you are using to do actions. These are actually cards that you're going to be giving to other players, and that will be given by the mechanics of the game to the other players. And so these cards, as I said before, basically they're suited, that new suit. They have a some amount militant or peaceful bent, and so whenever that other player uses that card when they play it and it returns to you, that is actually going to affect your stance. So like as it stands right now, we have a little track that's goes between militant and peaceful and can kind of get stuck on one of the ends. And so as other players are playing these cards, they might want to play a card at a specific time to push you in one direction or the other. Because, say, becoming more militant means that you'll get more warriors, sure. But fundamentally, becoming more militant also makes the woodland less sympathetic to you. And because the woodland is less sympathetic to you, you score fewer points. So there's kind of this trade-off of militancy makes the woodland kind of look at you askance and go, right. I don't know about these. They're not coming in peacefully. I don't these are not. We're not all about what they're doing, right. Basically. So other players will have different relationships with these cards because, the Eerie, as these tokens come out onto the map and create double suitings or cover-up suits, the Eerie will have different relationships with this. They might want to, go, okay, I'm invested in a peaceful coexistence with them because I know that if they start covering up these clearing suits, I'm probably going to fall into turmoil. So I really want to explore an interpenetration of the different factions, other players influencing you, how we look at the different populations in the woodland and how that can shift over time.
And I'll say broadly, if Marauder, I think, as an expansion, has probably one of the simplest factions in the Warlord and one of the more complex factions in the Keepers.
Yep.
Both of these factions appear to be to me soundly in the midweight.
Yeah.
But in ethos, they remind me so much of the Riverfolk factions.
Mm-hmm.
These are factions that are less militaristic. They're still high reach, for sure. They're high reach, but they are exploring the weirder and more political corners of Root.
Yes.
Because you can only cut a 4X cake so many ways, right? I mean, and I think that if you look at the Cats and the Eerie and the Warlord and the Duchy, those are your big empires.
Right.
And I think the Keepers are a pretty good small, mid-sized empire, and both of these two factions are a different type of Root.
Right.
And I'm really excited to just put them in the roster. Okay, well, lots of interesting questions in the chat that we don't necessarily have time for. Folks have asked about other ideas, decks, maps, all that kind of stuff. We will talk more about that later. You can pop it up. So I'll say generally that when we're working on a crowdfunding campaign, this is just something good to know generally. We always have to balance our dev interests with creating something that we think is going to resonate with the audience, so that we can raise the capital to keep doing the stuff that we're doing.
Right.
So there's always this like funny balance at work, and I'll give an example, right? So for Oath, we really want to produce a new Oath deck, and in fact, we have one that is like probably 60-70% through primary design. But that is an extremely expensive object because it is 60 illustrations.
Yep.
So it's about the most expensive thing that we could produce, and it's the worst return on investment for just creative dollar, right? Yep. So in order to make this work, we have to group that high investment thing with other elements, and maybe it gets put in the mainline Oath expansion, maybe it gets put in a small expansion. When it comes to things like Root, we have to make those same calculations with a deck or any maps that we might do, which tend to be very high creative investment products. And so we have to do a lot of that juggling, because that juggling is like very closely related to the crowdfunding pledge levels. We don't often know how it's all going to land until like weeks before we launch. Yep. And so if we're evasive about this stuff, know that it's because it's like very close to the core like calculus of how we stay in business, and we are still figuring that out. Okay, well, that's all we've got for you. Thank you all for coming to join us on this lovely Friday.
Thank you so much.
We won't see you until May. Second week of May, third week of May, maybe we'll be late next time. For folks who want an update about the ARC's shipping, I just wanted to say very briefly that we hope to have some news for you in our monthly Kickstarter update, which will be coming out in the next few weeks. It's all moving, no major delays. It's on the water in one way or another. Yep. But as per the last thing I said about it is we are at the stage with ARCs that it's just like totally out of our hand.
Yeah.
Like we are. I mean, I think a while ago I was like, it's a few months. I said this a few months ago, but I was like, it's several months from delivery, but like plus or minus a month or two. Yeah. It's very hard to know. We will have some better concrete dates probably towards the end of this month. And I think things are looking generally pretty good. We also will have some news about upcoming projects within the next couple months. So watch this space. We've got lots of exciting things in the works, and that is pretty much it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. It's been great talking.
All right, let's go play Beyblades.
Yes. Beyblades.
All right.